Well, maybe it is just the time of year, or maybe it's the time of man. I don't know who I am, but life is for learning. Joni Mitchell, Woodstock. Johnny Strongbow 3, The Day of the Hunter. Written by Gary Nicholson. Chapter 7. It was an insane asylum. The group gathered in the meeting room in the apartment. Klamotki and Sitali were excited because they were told it was a time transmission. It was a little confusing because it was from the 21st century and not the 22nd. It was explained to them that Johnny and his friends lived in the 22nd century and were sent back to the 3rd century to interact with them. They were also told the transmission was from the author. The author of what? They would soon find out. The spirits wouldn't give us an indication on how long we will be here, Renzo said. Maybe if we confront him head on, he will let us know. I wouldn't count on it, Renzo, Johnny said. He can be as elusive as they are. I think they share the same mindset. I've only spoken to him on a few occasions, Trina said. This will be interesting. He certainly has an obsession with Mesoamerica, Cindy said. This is interesting in itself. He also has an obsession with corrupt governments and criminality, Amber said. It will be interesting to see where he sends us next. Johnny's large monitor flickered. The group watched with excitement as the face appeared on the screen. How is everyone doing? I asked. Has the weather been hot and humid as it is in modern-day Honduras? The weather has been very humid, Johnny said. It was much cooler when we were in the Andes. Now, tell us why you called this meeting. And while you're at it, tell us how long we will be here. I don't want to give away too much to the readers yet. It will spoil the story. I called this meeting because I've been doing some deep thinking as to where I'm from and where I'm going in my life. I just lived past my 69th birthday, and now it's the 4th of July. I don't celebrate either one of those. I just have some concerns I want to address before I get older. You're not getting any older to us, Johnny said. You died in the previous century. The twist is that you sent us 2,000 years into the past, not to mention to an obscure point in history historians know so little about. The fact that we know so little of Mesoamerica and pre-Columbian Peru makes it all the more intriguing. This point in time is the epitome of how I see the human race as a self-hating, self-destructive species. It's even in our language. I sent you to a time long before there was an America. We have the audacity to call it Mesoamerican and pre-Columbian long before Amerigo Vespucci or Christopher Columbus were born. I want Klamotki and Sitali to be proud that they lived in a culture that was more advanced and civilized than the overrated Roman Empire. It dawned on me through the course of this that I sent you to a time that coincides with the decline and fall of the Romans. This much is coincidental. What about us? Johnny asked. Do you care about us and what happens to this little world you created? Thanks for asking, Johnny. Of course, I care about all of you. You are my voice to the world, my progeny. You are the immortal part of my psyche. You will live on long after I am gone. That's obvious, Cindy said. We live in the latter half of the 22nd century, and God willing to the 23rd. Yes, this is true. Thankfully, I have a love for science fiction. If you read between the lines, you may see Ray Bradbury. There's also Robert A. Heinlein, Philip K. Dick, and many more. It's not that I want anyone to see them. They were my inspiration to write. Mostly, you will see me. You call yourself an artist, Johnny said. What makes you an artist? Good question. I was drawing before I was 10 years old. I've always been fascinated by artists. Vincent van Gogh caught my interest when I was in 3rd grade. I was obsessed with Leonardo da Vinci as a teenager. I've been painting all my life. Like most artists, I've been stabbed in the back by people who claim to be my friends. You seem to have many obsessions, Cindy said. This is from politics to criminal behavior. You lash out at religion and military. I could go on. It makes good drama, but it seems to be a waste of time. All good points, Cindy. Everything I do is a waste of time. There is no point to making art in a world that rejects art and artist. You answered your own question. I have obsessions. All artists are obsessive. From Da Vinci to Dali and beyond. It's the nature of the beast. You have a fascination with music, Renzo said. You quote many musicians. It is admirable to a point, but you carry it to fanaticism. This is true. The word fan is the short form of fanatic. I am a true fan of music, poetry, and literature. I don't have a problem with your fanaticism, Trina said. I get to act them out in all of your scenarios. I am the projection of your logical mind. Yes, I use you to point out the obvious and not so obvious. You are the observation of the human race from someone from another star system. The alien in me wants to show the savagery of the human race. It never evolved, even by its own standards. How far back does this go? Johnny asked. At what point in your life did you start making these observations? It stems from early childhood. I had an abusive alcoholic father. My mother was loving, but absent mentally. They were incapable of raising children, but were good at producing them. I grew up with 4 sisters and 5 brothers. I was 4th in line with 3 older sisters. I believe my father's abusiveness rubbed off on his children. My 3 older sisters were self-centered to the point of cruelty. My next to younger brother was sadistic. He was abusive to the point of torture. No one was immune, including my mother. She allowed it to happen. He had a high opinion of himself and a low opinion of everyone else. Excluding my youngest brother and youngest sister, we were a band of liars and thieves. I told my mother on many occasions, this isn't a family, it's an insane asylum. It sounds like you had it rough, Cindy said. When did science fiction become an active part of your life? I was always fascinated with it. I remember seeing Forbidden Planet when I was 8 years old. It's still a favorite. I saw War of the Worlds before I was 10. The Day the Earth Stood Still had an impact on me. Of course, I'm a Star Trek fan. In books, it's a similar fascination. When I was 13, just out of school from summer break, I was bored with nothing to do. I remember standing by the road wondering what I was going to do that day. I took a notion to walk to the library. This was the beginning of my obsession with Robert A. Heinlein. This is associated with my obsession with rockets. I was browsing through the library and spotted a book with a rocket on its spine. It was Red Planet by Robert A. Heinlein. I read it 3 times before I returned it to the library. What is your obsession with government? Renzo asked. This seems to take up much of your time. This is a very good question, Renzo. Believe it or not, everyone is obsessed with the fucking government, and it wastes a lot of our time. I apologize for joining in on this annoyance. There is nothing more useless than politics and politicians. The government is a danger to itself and everyone else. Wow, Cindy said. Do you lean Democrat, Republican, or Independent? I have no leanings. The labels are meaningless. The country is controlled by corporations. The political system is a facade. The elections are a mere smokescreen. This is an educated way of calling it fascist. So you do not see voting as a means to an end? Renzo asked. Maybe before I was born or when I was too young to vote. I remember the JFK assassination. Fascism was taking hold before then. This is when it came into full swing. I remember LBJ being sworn in and the idiocy of the Vietnam War. I was anti-Vietnam War and I graduated to anti-war. You certainly have strong feelings, Johnny said. This does come out in your writing. What is war to you? Does it have any meaning? Of course. War is the ultimate in human sacrifice. It has the same value as black magic. People say it all the time. War equals freedom. It's for the common good, etc. It's only senseless killing, and it serves no real purpose. You mentioned human sacrifice, Cindy said. I, as with most people, find human sacrifice disgusting. It is primal and savage. Thank you. Yes, and there are many forms of it, like capital punishment. Not that I believe in capital punishment, Renzo said. What do you say to someone who believes in a life for a life? Here we go again. Where does it stop? Revenge is self-perpetuating and endless. A world full of false flags and the whole 9 yards. It's nonsense. This is why you keep saying the human race never evolved, Cindy said. To a certain point I agree. I am struggling with the concept. Join the club. This is my observation, Traina said. The human race spends much of its time destroying itself instead of being reasonable. This goes back to your obsession with music, Johnny said. The Beatles, Pink Floyd, The Who, etc. John Lennon's Imagine. He said all the world leaders are insane. Remember I said I grew up in an insane asylum? In a sense, we all did. The world is a fucking insane asylum. I fucking agree, Cindy said. You were talking about things that happened long after Sitali and me are dead, Tlemokwi said. What does this have to do with us? You have a point, Tomokwi. You were somewhat protected from the Europeans before they learned how to navigate the Atlantic Ocean. In 1519, a Spaniard by the name of Hernando Cortez landed in Honduras, bringing their diseases and prejudices with them. Neil Young wrote an awesome song commemorating it, Cortez the Killer. Cortez and his minions had no understanding of your culture. I believe the conquistadors got their little minds blown. They had the audacity to consider themselves superior. They also insulted your existence by calling you Indians. This was long before they realized this wasn't India. The Aztecs embraced them as gods. They gave them food and shelter. When all was said and done, they took Montezuma prisoner. They took over the city. The ones they didn't kill, they took as slaves. They looted the city of its gold and other valuable artifacts, much of which ended up in the Vatican. What is the Vatican? Tlemokwi asked. That's not important now. Needless to say, the Spaniards didn't need to build a colony. They moved into the houses and apartments they emptied. They didn't change the name. It remains Mexico to this day. I am only happy this is over 1,200 years in the future, Tlemokwi said. It will be a horror for our descendants. Yes, I agree. I believe Johnny has feelings on this too. My study of history goes back to a place called Pine Ridge, Johnny said. It was just over 300 years after Cortez, in 1824. The so-called Bureau of Indian Affairs was written by the War Department. Early on, the lies and deceit of the U.S. government were apparent. Nearly 30 years later, the Treaty of Laramie was written, making Lakota a sovereign nation. This held for 10 years, then fell apart. President Lincoln violated the treaty with the so-called Homestead Act. This put white non-natives on Lakota land. This brought on a Sioux uprising in 1863 in Minnesota. This ended with the hanging of 38 Sioux, the largest mass execution in U.S. history. The execution was ordered by Abraham Lincoln 2 days after he announced the Emancipation Proclamation. The building of the first transcontinental railroad started in 1866. This cut across Lakota land. The Lakota began calling white people Wasichu, which means greedy. The railroad was completed in 1869. The railroad hired gunmen to shoot buffalo, cutting off a vital survival resource for the Lakota. In 1871, the so-called Indian Appropriations Act made all natives a ward of the federal government. They were not allowed to leave the reservations. George Custer discovered gold in the Black Hills in 1874. White prospectors flooded the Lakota territory. All this, a clear violation of treaty. Custer recommended to the government to close all treaties. The Lakota War began with the violation of these treaties. Custer eventually got his ass kicked at the Little Bighorn. After all this, the Pine Ridge Lakota Reservation was designated Prisoner of War Camp 334 by the U.S. military. As far as I know, this remains to this day. Thank you for the history, Johnny. I have strong feelings on this. I may look like a long-haired, underprivileged, no-good white boy. My name is Scottish. On my mother's side, I'm Polish. My great-great-grandmother was Choctaw. I am proud of my heritage. I am gratified that I have DNA that goes back thousands of years on this continent. I am also proud that my lineage goes back to Europe. Too bad I don't have Oriental blood. That would be a kicker. The fact that the whites treated and treat the native-born badly is no surprise. History is riddled with their prejudice and conceit. Old laws written long ago attest to this fact. Laws to impose ignorance upon the masses. The story of Hypatia stands as a testimony of widespread ignorance. Hypatia was far ahead of her time. She was single, educated, and a strong-minded woman. She deemed herself a philosopher. She worked and taught at the Library of Alexandria in Egypt. Her downfall was teaching the Copernican theory that the Earth is a sphere that orbits the Sun. There was a rapid growing Christian cult in the area. They deemed her a heretic for not denouncing her pagan roots. A mad mob of these so-called Christians skinned her alive with clam shells. After this was done, they made a mock pagan ritual. In the end, they burned her beloved library to the ground. This won't happen for 100 years from your time, Tlamoquis. A few hundred years later, a man by the name of Giordano Bruno was tried and convicted of the same thing. He was tortured, hung upside down, and burned at the stake. This execution was carried out in the same place Julius Caesar was murdered. Who was Julius Caesar? Tlamoquis asked. He was one of the emperors of the place called Rome I mentioned earlier. Last but not least, there was Galileo Galilei. The world by this time conceded that the earth was in fact round. Whoop-de-doo-wah. The problem with Galileo was he was saying things like, there are spots on the sun, and there are rings around Saturn. How can there be spots on the sun? Tlamoquis asked. I had a feeling you'd be interested in this. I am prepared to show you this. A picture-in-picture digital video of the sun displayed on the screen. As you see, there are spots all over the sun. Oh, look, it'll be on the right. You can see Mercury on the plane of the ecliptic. Is this the sun? Tlamoquis asked. It is bright in some areas. What are the dark areas? Those are the dark spots. In a sense, they are like volcanoes. You may see what we call a solar flare. Oh, there was one there. How is it possible to be so close? This video was shot with a specialized solar telescope. The techno imagery gets better all the time. Now switching over, this is Saturn. Ah, Tlamoquis and Satali uttered in harmony. You can see why our late renowned astronomer Carl Sagan referred to Saturn's rings as enigmatic. Our astronomers talk of the grandeur of Saturn, Satali said, yet never like this. I'll have to tell you, Satali, the astronomers of your time were amazing in their abilities given the devices they had. Their astronomical knowledge was very impressive. The picture-in-picture disengaged. When Galileo talked about these things and wrote about them in his journals, his colleagues were stunned. They couldn't believe he was convinced of these things. He was tried for heresy and sentenced to 7 years in prison. When released, he was made a ward of the church for the rest of his life. He was restricted from writing and could not mention any of his findings. This was 100 years after Cortez murdered the Aztecs. I see what you mean by enforced ignorance, Renzo said. If I wasn't an educated Italian, I might have slapped you. Ha ha! Go to the head of the class, Renzo. As you see, the conquest of the New World was much the same as what was happening in Europe. Raping and pillaging was commonplace. I could talk about how the Vikings landed several hundred years ahead of the other Europeans. They landed much farther north in a place called Newfoundland. It isn't surprising that the Spaniards killed the Aztecs and took their gold. They thought they were in India. When they realized their blunder, they didn't want to leave empty-handed. It's also not surprising they continued referring to the natives as Indians. After all, who wants to admit they're wrong? Getting back to human sacrifice, I am not here to defend it. I agree with Cindy wholeheartedly. The crucifixion, not only of Christ, is the epitome, yet human sacrifice is prevalent in most cultures. It is akin to cannibalism. Speaking of which, the Catholic Church is pseudo cannibalism, not to mention they are the last surviving remnants of the Roman Empire. Must you be so blatant? Cindy asked. It's bad enough they exist. Why talk about them? Did it ever occur to you that talking about it may bring up a discussion of a solution? Is the human race ready for the truth? Not ready in the 21st century and not ready in the 22nd. I guess evolving to a greater understanding is out of the question. If only I had Kurt Vonnegut's chronosynclastic infundibulum. I could zip back and forth through time as easily as you can teleport anywhere you want. Did it ever occur to you there is more to the story? Renzo asked. Yes, of course, there is always more. You can dig deep into history and dig up many bones. But then, I'm writing a novel, not the Encyclopedia Britannica. The most part I'm leaving out is when people can't justify their actions, they blame it on the victims. In the course of this, they make a lot of shit up. Ha ha! Renzo chuckled. How much of this story did you make up? A lot of it, I assure you. It's up to the reader. If they are concerned how much is factual and how much is brain droppings. In the case of the crucifixion, Mick Jagger summed it up when he said, I made damn sure Pilate washed his hands when he sealed his fate. You can take this out of context and apply it to many things. I do not claim to be perfect, Renzo, and it will be my imperfections the world will use to rip me apart. The trial of Christ was complicated to say the least. Many of us cannot discern his crime. He was tried, convicted, and executed. There had to have been a crime. According to the angry Hebrew mob, he was guilty of heresy. The Romans didn't have any laws governing heresy. They translated this to mean treason. Treason by Roman law was a capital offense. Crucifixion was the only recourse. Actually, Pilate judged him innocent by Roman law. It is undiscernible as to why the execution took place at all. Just like most of the facts of the Aztec and Mayan cultures, this is lost in history. Somehow you tie all this together as it is one thing, Renzo said. It is, my dear Renzo. We called it history, and it was an insane asylum. It is a prerequisite of birth. We kiss the ass of the elite. This is drilled into us by our parents, and then we pass it on to our children. All the while, we deny this is happening. Arguments are endless. The concept of slavery is ancient. If you study history, you'll see that the purview and perspective changes. Slavery remains, and the divisions of the classes are a testimony. People are judged by the amount of money they have, the clothes they wear, the car they drive. The homeless? Forget it, they're not a part of the human race. Do people ask what kind of drugs you're taking? Cindy asked. Thanks for asking. I get this all the time. Mostly from those who can't get through the day without their hit of marijuana and their little snort of cocaine. I don't take drugs, not even pharma. I'm not a drinker either. I'm naturally gonzo. What is marijuana? Tlamoqui asked. We have things in our culture like the things you describe. Marijuana is another name for cannabis sativa. A lot of it grows in your area. Much of the world's supply of cocaine comes from there too. I believe much of it is used in your rituals. I see your point, Tlamoqui said. Sitali and I enjoy the mushroom. Yes, I am aware. Not too much of it, I hope. Tlamoqui and Sitali chuckled. All this goes back to song lyrics again. So, you think you can tell heaven from hell? It's all in the way we view and accept things. We all have our coping mechanisms. If your coping mechanism is a substance, it may just kill you. We are taught to believe in things. Most people hold on to these beliefs through the course of their lives. To question these beliefs, whether they have a substance or not, evokes anger. Another of my obsessions is I question things. One of my favorite song lyrics. It's getting to the point where I'm no fun anymore. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young. Taken out of context, it describes me well. This is why I love rock and roll. It dares to challenge the status quo. The Who is a very good example. We're all slaves to the phony leaders. Breathe the air they had blown you. From Quadrophenia. Science fiction has its moments too. 1984 by George Orwell is a definite kick in the side of fascism. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury rocks too. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells is a mind blower, and so is War of the Worlds. You seem to be down on everything, Renzo said. Is there anything about the human race you're not ashamed of? This is another good question, Renzo. I'm proud of you. Art, literature, the sciences, and all the creative endeavors. Some movies have fascinated me. I abhor the military, politics, political science, excessively greedy corporations, etc. All this is obvious. Do you think you're any different? I mean, is any of this a self-loathing? It would have to be, wouldn't it? I think if you checked my DNA, you'd see that I'm human. I question everything, including my own sanity. I can't deny my anger. It's a hard world to get a break in. All the good things have been taken. My Life by Eric Burden and the Animals. I feel this, and I express this in many ways. I don't know how to change it. I just observe and question. I'd love to change the world, but I don't know what to do, so I leave it up to you. 10 Years After with Alvin Lee, one of my favorite lines in a song. Tax the rich, feed the poor, till there are no rich no more. The song rocks with classic overtones. Then back to The Who. Out here in the fields, I fought for my meals. I get my back into my living. I don't need to fight to prove I'm right. I don't need to be forgiven. These are all hard-hitting things, like blows against the empire from Jefferson Airplane. I will leave my art to this world when I go, and I will never return. The reincarnationist can have a field day. I believe you can come back, but why? Aside from the fact that soon there will be no world to return to, there is no reason. Why return to a world that is much worse than when you left it? It sounds like you've given it some thought, Cindy said. It almost sounds like I'll never be born. This is a tragic thought. It does sound bleak, doesn't it? No worries. You will exist inside my mind until I go. This is all of you. Hopefully there will be enough readers to plant you in their minds too. I, for one, am glad you created us, Amber said. We will never grow old, and the adventures are endless. I will let you guys explore the world I put you in. I'm going to contemplate the next few chapters. Until then, don't let the past remind us of what we are. Not now. Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young.